In the small town of Brookhaven, St. Jude Hospital stood like a grim monument on the skyline. By day, it was a place of healing, where doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to save lives. But at night, when the lights went out and silence descended, the hospital transformed into something completely different. Sarah, a brave and dedicated night nurse, was used to the dark side of St. Jude Hospital. Her shifts often began when the sun set and ended when the day dawned. The darkness of the corridors and the echo of her own footsteps were her frequent companions. That night, the sound of rain hitting the windows added an extra layer of gloom to the hospital. Drops of water ran down the windows, creating a spectacle of dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah began her routine rounds, checking on patients and checking monitors. As she walked through the silent hallways, Sarah felt an unusual sense of unease. The footsteps echoed alone, creating a feeling of deep loneliness. She looked back from time to time, but saw nothing but the shadows writhing on the walls. Sarah was on her way to the pediatric ward, the darkest part of the hospital at night. The pediatric patients' empty rooms seemed even scarier when uninhabited. The made but empty beds created an atmosphere of desolation. As Sarah made her rounds, something caught her attention. A dim light came from one of the pediatric rooms, although there were no children admitted that night. Intrigued, she approached the half-open door, wondering if someone had forgotten to turn off the light. The room was small and quiet, with a window that looked outside, where the rain continued to fall. However, what caught Sarah's attention was the figure of a child sitting on the bed, facing away from her. The child appeared to be looking at the window, his shoulders shaking as if he was silently crying. In a soft, worried voice, Sarah asked, "What are you doing here, sweetheart? Where are your parents?" She got no response. The child remained motionless, staring at the window. Sarah took a step forward, approaching the child. She was about to touch the child's shoulder when something made her freeze in place. She noticed that there was no reflection of the child in the window pane. A feeling of apprehension grew within her. Before Sarah could react, the child's figure turned to her. The child's face was pale as the moon and his eyes were two empty, dark sockets. A chilling smile formed on the child's lips, and he began to laugh, a cold, disturbing laugh that echoed throughout the room. Sarah recoiled in horror, stumbling out of the room and closing the door behind her. The child's evil laughter continued to echo in her mind as she ran through the dark hallways looking for help. Sarah told her strange experience to her co-workers on the ward, but most of them believed she was under stress due to the pressure of night work at the hospital. They tried to reassure her that there was nothing to worry about, and that the ghost children were nothing more than a figment of her imagination. However, that night, strange events at St. Jude Hospital began to intensify. Other nurses and doctors began reporting sightings of pale, frightening children in the hallways, particularly in the pediatric ward. They also heard spine-chilling laughter at night, even when there were no pediatric patients admitted. The atmosphere at the hospital became increasingly oppressive, and night staff avoided certain areas where sightings were more frequent. Patients, in turn, began to complain of disturbing dreams and feelings that they were being watched by invisible eyes. Sarah, on the other hand, was determined to unravel the mystery behind the pale children's appearances. She spent hours researching the history of St. Jude Hospital, delving into old archives and talking to retired employees. It was during her investigations that Sarah made an alarming discovery. It turned out that the hospital had operated as an orphanage decades ago, before being converted into a hospital. Many children had lived and died there due to illness and neglect. Old hospital records contained reports of mistreatment and stories of children who claimed to see pale figures at night. One name in particular caught Sarah's attention: Emily, a girl who had died at the hospital when it was still an orphanage. Sarah was convinced that the apparitions were the spirits of the children who had suffered at the orphanage. She believed that the souls of these children were trapped in the hospital, unable to find peace. Determined to help them, she began to plan a ritual of purification and communication with the spirits. She knew that this task was dangerous and that it could put her own life at risk, but she could not ignore the suffering of the ghost children. She decided to act the next night, when the moon was full and the darkness of the hospital was deeper. The next night, Sarah gathered candles, incense, and an ancient book of spiritual rituals that she had found in her studies. She chose the abandoned room where she had found the orphanage's old records as the place to perform the ritual. The hospital was quieter than ever as Sarah lit the candles and began to recite the words of the ritual. She asked the children's spirits to speak out, to find peace, and leave the hospital for good. As the ritual took place, the hospital seemed to hold its breath. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, and all the night staff felt an invisible presence watching them, as if the souls of the children were there, gathered to hear Sarah's words. As Sarah continued reciting the words of the ritual, the atmosphere at St. Jude Hospital became even more oppressive. The feeling that something extraordinary was about to happen hung in the air. The night staff felt the weight of the unknown on their shoulders, but no one dared interrupt the ritual. Sarah was completely immersed in the ceremony. Her eyes were fixed on the candles that burned with soft golden flames, and her words were spoken with conviction and compassion. She repeated the names of the children who had suffered in the orphanage, calling for them to find peace. As the ritual progressed, absolute silence took over the hospital. The night nurses and doctors kept their eyes fixed on the room where Sarah was performing the ritual. The appearances of the pale children, which were once frequent, seemed to have dissipated. Sarah felt a pulsing energy around her. She knew she was making contact with the children's spirits, and her heart was full of empathy and compassion for them. She continued reciting the words of the ritual, asking the spirits to find peace and leave the hospital in peace. Then, something extraordinary happened. A gentle, comforting breeze began to blow through the room, blowing out the candles one by one. The dancing shadows on the walls seemed to calm down, and a sense of calm and serenity filled the space. Sarah knew that the children's spirits had found peace. She ended the ritual with gratitude and relief, feeling that she had accomplished her mission of helping lost souls move forward. When she left the room, she found the other night staff waiting outside, eager to hear about what had happened. She explained how the children's spirits had responded to the ritual and how the atmosphere in the hospital seemed to have changed. Since that night, St. Jude Hospital has begun to return to normal. The apparitions of the pale children disappeared, and patients and staff no longer felt haunted by night terrors. Sarah's ritual had worked, and the children's souls finally found the peace they so deserved. Sarah continued to work at the hospital, now with a feeling of relief and accomplishment. She knew that she had helped lost souls find peace, and the nightmare that had haunted the place had finally come to an end. However, Sarah would never forget the dark nights she faced the unknown at St. Jude Hospital. She had learned that sometimes a place's dark past can leave a lasting mark, and that evil can persist, waiting to be confronted and defeated. And so, the hospital once again became a place of healing, where lives were saved and hope was restored. But the memory of the pale children and the ritual that brought peace to their souls would remain forever in Sarah's memory. As the days passed, the atmosphere at St. Jude Hospital continued to improve. Sightings of the pale children disappeared completely, and patients and staff no longer felt haunted by the night terrors that had previously afflicted them. Sarah continued working at the hospital, now with a feeling of relief and accomplishment. She knew that she had helped lost souls find peace, and the nightmare that had haunted the place had finally come to an end. However, she couldn't help but think of the children who had lived and suffered in the orphanage decades ago. They had finally found peace, but their tragic story moved her deeply. She decided that she couldn't let their memory fade. Sarah began researching more about the children at the orphanage and discovered that there was a mass grave in the local cemetery where many of them had been buried without a proper ceremony. She felt it was her responsibility to honor the memory of these children and give them a dignified burial. With the help of her co-workers and the local community, Sarah organized a ceremony to honor the children at the orphanage. Headstones were engraved with the children's names and their stories, and a memorial was erected in the cemetery. On the night of the ceremony, a sense of peace filled the air. Distant relatives of the children, some of whom had never met their lost relatives, came to pay their respects. Candles were lit, and flowers were placed on headstones, while children's stories were shared. Sarah talked about the night she performed the ritual at the hospital and how the children finally found peace. She thanked the children's souls for allowing her to help them and promised that they would never be forgotten. As the ceremony drew to a close, a gentle breeze blew through the cemetery, making the candles dance in their hands. It was as if the children's souls were there, thanking them for finally finding peace and eternal rest. The nightmare had come to its definitive end. St. Jude Hospital once again became a place of healing, where lives were saved and hope was restored. The stories of the children lost at the orphanage were now remembered with affection and respect. Sarah continued to work as a night nurse at the hospital, and although the nights were still dark and silent, she was no longer afraid. She knew that the children of the past were at peace and that their sacrifice had not been in vain. And so, the story of St. Jude Hospital became a lesson in compassion, perseverance, and courage. Evil was confronted and defeated, and lost souls finally found the peace they so deserved.